Welcome to this YouTube channel that is called the Butterfly Framework, a discernment tool that I am developing as a contribution to the process on synodality that is happening in the Church these days. The Catholic Church is inviting us to journey together, and that is the main purpose of this channel, to journey together as we listen to each other, as we trust each other, as we welcome different voices, as we welcome diversity. Also is a place where we are attempting to engage in transforming historical harms, in healing the wounds that are present still in our church. It is also the place where we are encouraged to welcome the power of the imagination and also to give a space to visions and prophecies. It is a place that attempts to bring resourcefulness to this synodal process. And first and foremost is a resource place for myself, because also I am a member of the church. Also I am in a process of becoming more and more synodal. Also, I am in a process of welcoming the diverse voices within myself and in the context in which I am. I am learning more and more to appreciate diversity within the church and to live at peace with that. So my wish for this channel is to create a venue where we accompany each other, where we enrich each other, where we empower each other. And I believe that the moment has arrived in the church to do so. So the first person and the first voice that is welcome in this channel is the one of Diarmuid O'Murchu. Let us start watching the headlines of the interview.
Let's look at our common humanity as we gather in this gathering, the Synod, or whatever gathering it may be. First and foremost, we're all human beings in this room. Whether you're a parish priest, whether you're a cardinal, whether you're a pope, we're all human beings. Let's start there. A huge number of people were saying how great and how good it was to be listened to. And so for me, that begs the question, then what was the listening that has gone on since Vatican II? Well, that springs to mind that there are issues there that do need to be clarified around what we mean by synodality. So I presume then the goal of the synodality, as understood by Vatican II, was to create a more communal context within the life of the church. But by and large, these lay people are bringing a ferment into theology, into scripture. They're asking deeper questions. They are asking the more adult questions. Our spirituality should be exploring primarily what would holarchical structures look like, whether among humans or in the wider world of nature. And therefore, I think for our church here needs to listen to the insights and the wisdom of some of these other sciences. They're almost saying, which would be a very unhealthy thing now to say, we must not touch or interfere with the hierarchical reality of our church. It's a God-given reality. Well, if it's not a God-given reality in creation, then why should it be a God-given reality in the life of the church? I think this is a very sensitive, delicate, but important question that does need to be looked. So, no, I wouldn't want the church to say we must become a democracy, because the whole history of democracy itself, I think, is somewhat tainted and problematic. What I would want to say is we must become more communitarian. And therefore, in terms of communitarian or communal process, we're looking therefore at decision-making primarily through consensus. And that's a very skillful art and not an easy one to achieve. And therefore, how do our leaders and how do our people begin to work together to create a church and a world where mutual empowerment becomes more real and more fulfilling to the benefit of everybody, and indeed to the benefit of the wider creation as well. there is a crucifixion of clericalism going on. Sacraments belong primarily to people. They do not belong primarily to priests. So what do we need to do to begin handing the sacraments back to our people? Because our people have great difficulty. They don't even know how to begin reclaiming. There's a huge re-education to be done first. And of course, we'd all love to be in the place of the midwife. Very often the midwife cannot do its work, her work, until we first attend to the needs of the hospice carer. And the hospice carer is the one who sits with the dying and tries to allow and facilitate as much dignity and peace for the dying person or the dying reality. And so the tendency to over-spiritualize is, I think, a real danger for us. Can we call a halt to that? Can we speak to it? Can we challenge it? Well, if everybody is nice to each other and we keep a spirit of prayer, it will work well. Whereas, in fact, we have some very difficult issues to face, and even naming them will not be pleasant. But they need to be named if we're to be people of integrity in a church of integrity. Because as I understand Christian discernment, it's looking at all the factors that are involved, the pleasant ones as well as the unpleasant ones. In an atmosphere of consensus, then begin asking, where is the Spirit leading us here or inviting us here? And maybe reminding people that often the Spirit is most fertile in the midst of chaos. We see that in the opening verses of the book of Genesis. The Spirit drawing forth order and creativity from the chaos of creation itself. It's this word systemic, that we humans are not just creatures who operate on our own, as if only the human reality mattered. We're all part of systems. We're all part of structures, political, economic, social, and so forth. And these structures and institutions can have a far bigger influence on us than we care to acknowledge. I would say politically, economically, and ecclesiastically, we need to be moving away from hierarchies towards something more of the holarchical paradigm. But we, through our human behaviors, particularly our collective behaviors, and the behaviors that we're often not aware of, we can seriously block the Spirit at work, particularly in our group processes. And so again, the elephant in the room there would be something about that we're treating certain people, whether it's our priests or our bishops or whatever, that somehow or other they have a perfection or a holiness that the rest of us don't have. And so putting them on this pedestal, which at the end of the day does no good for them, nor for the church at large. There's little or no recognition of the damage being done to local communities. So the only accountability is from the top down. There's no facility in place there for a mutual accountability. In the galactic world, in the planetary world, there's huge destruction going on all the time. And if that wasn't going on, we wouldn't have the beauty of creation that we have. Earthquakes are absolutely essential to the well-being of planet Earth. Paradox is an innate God-given dimension of life. With the study of scholastic philosophy, there's a huge amount of emphasis put on keeping everything very rational. Now, rationality is the opposite of paradox in a sense. I think the mystics were among the people that embraced paradox in a more experiential and direct way. So there is something about learning to flow with that process. There's something about learning to accept it and feel okay about it, despite the fact that I'm feeling very sad or feeling vulnerable in the face of it. Unfortunately, we have even to disagree with St. Paul that death is the consequence of sin. It's not. Death is an integral dimension and a very necessary dimension of this process, even dying. And then the opening up to the new possibility, which will have unexpected elements in it, unforeseen elements, maybe elements of sheer surprise. Some will be very joyful and some may be very perplexing. In other words, when we talk about protecting, are we protecting with a view to allowing life organically and in more evolutionary terms to evolve towards greater complexity, which will at times messy and untidy? Or are we trying to protect so that we're trying to keep just law and order all the time, which is not going to work? So if we're rushing too much for protection and for order, we're going to miss the richness of the process. And we're also going to inhibit the spirit, which, as we have already said, will often work through chaos.
Diarmuid, good morning and welcome to this interview.
Good morning to you.
So Diarmuid, I would like to introduce you to our audience as we start the interview.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Then you are a member of the Sacred Heart Missionary Order and a graduate of Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. You are a social psychologist, most of whose work in life has been in social ministry, predominantly in London, UK. In that capacity, you have worked as a couples counsellor, grieving counselling, AIDS-HIV counselling, and in more recent times with homeless people and refugees. As a workshop leader and group facilitator, you have worked in many countries all around the world, facilitating programs on adult faith development. Your best-known books include Quantum Theology, Ancestral Grace, Jesus in the Power of Poetry, Christianity's Dangerous Memory, In the Beginning Was the Spirit, Incarnation, A New Evolutionary Threshold, Beyond Original Sin, and When the Disciple Comes of Age. Diarmuid, in the beginning of this interview, I would like to quote this text from the preparatory document on the Synod, number 32. It is said, "The purpose of this Synod, and therefore of this consultation, is not to produce documents, but to plant dreams, draw forth prophecies and visions, allow hope to flourish, inspire trust, bind up wounds, weave together relationships, awaken a dawn of hope, learn from one another, and create upright resourcefulness." Diarmuid, this is a quite inspirational text and a source of motivation for this YouTube channel and also for this interview. So let me just ask this first question. Then, knowing that we are in this synod on synodality, now how relevant is this particular moment in the history of the Church?
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me into the conversation. I too like the opening quote that you have given. And it certainly is very aspirational and visionary and full of hope and so forth. I think one of my main concerns, however, is for a need for some clarity. And therefore, at a very early stage, I would like this synod to actually address the title itself, a synod on synodality. And the very word synod, what it denotes, what it means, and what are the hopes that are being built around it. Now, as I understand it, the concept of the Synod, as we understand it today, and as we're employing it today, came with Vatican II. And it was an important instrument in what Vatican II called collegiality. And that was where there was a movement away from the Pope himself, giving very direct instructions to the Universal Church, and then leaving it, well, indeed expecting the bishops and the priests to pick up those guidelines and take them forward and pass them on to the people of God. And the understanding, as I have it from Vatican II, is that the Pope, instead of dealing directly with the people, are passing the message down in a hierarchical line, that they would work much more directly with the bishops, that they began to see the bishops as key instrumental people in the process of collegiality. I think the intention was, keeping with the spirit of Vatican II, that the church is the people of God, that the bishops themselves would enter into a deeper dialogue with the people in this process of collegiality. Now, to that end, they did set up bishops' conferences around the world. And I guess some of them did try to link a bit more closely with the people, but a lot of them didn't. They were basically in-house conversational bases among the bishops themselves. One of the missing elements, or at least one of the elements that I'm quite unclear about, and perhaps that's where I'm feeling the need for clarity, is what role do the priests have in that entire process? Because I certainly have heard stories from priests who felt very excluded by their bishops, or still had relationships with bishops of the old patriarchal style. The bishop gave a command, you went and you did it, kind of thing. The bishop changed you to a new parish and gave you a week's notice, that kind of more hierarchical, patriarchal approach. So where the priests fitted in to this whole collegial approach is something I'm not at all clear about. And consequently then, because the people were seen as relating with the priests rather than relating with the bishops, because of the lack of clarity around the priests, I think the people of God were often left unclear also as to where that process was leading to. Now, what I find interesting then in the preparation here in Europe, and I'll speak merely from my European experience of last year, when the people first gathered into these groups and began having conversations, a huge number of people were saying how great and how good it was to be listened to. And so for me, that begs the question, then what was the listening that has gone on since Vatican II? Because it sounds like that a lot of people feel they have not been listened to, and that they now were being listened to. So it feels like there's a catching up to be done there. And so to get clarity, so I presume then the goal of the synodality as understood by Vatican II was to create a more communal context within the life of the church. So to use the language that's often used in Roman documents, that the church is a community of communities, or a communion of communities, so that there's a communal sense and a movement towards greater consensus around everything that's important for the people of God. And that's a stage we have not reached. I think it exists in parts of the Catholic world, so it's quite haphazard. And I think bishops themselves have a whole range of different understandings about it. And I think Francis himself, who is desperately eagerly desiring a church in which there is greater communication, in which there is greater sharing, I think is caught in quite a dilemma. And we saw that dilemma a few years back in one of the earlier synods when he became Pope, when a major issue, a pastoral issue arose about the position of divorced remarried people in the Catholic Church being prohibited to receive the sacraments. And there was a strong desire that should be changed, particularly for people, okay, they're divorced and remarried, but they're deeply involved in their parish communities. They're obviously people of faith and of goodwill, and they should be given full freedom to come to the sacraments. And it seemed, and indeed Francis himself very strongly indicated that was his desire. What happened in the particular synod where it was discussed and explored, at the very end, Francis said he wasn't going to take up any position on it. He was going to pass it on to the bishops, so that each local ordinary would deal with it in his own diocese. And see, that's the theory and the practice of the collegiality. But unfortunately, then it turned out to be something of a disaster, because most bishops, it seems, did nothing about it. Either they were uncomfortable with it themselves, or perhaps those who tried to do something about it met with various degrees of unease or opposition from the priests, and maybe in some cases from the people, particularly these particular human groups that tend to be rather right-wing, as we say. And so the issue really has remained unresolved. And I suppose that's the kind of example that springs to mind, that there are issues there that do need to be clarified around what we mean by synodality. The other contribution that I feel I want to make to it is this. I'm not an extensive reader of Roman documents, but from the ones I'm familiar with, and I've heard other people make this observation too, that when you look at Roman documents since Vatican II, particularly related to the church itself, they all tend to begin with chapters. Supposing we have a document of 5 chapters. Chapter 1, the church is about communion and community, drawing on the whole ecclesial dimension of Paul's view and Paul's understanding. Absolutely right, in my opinion. Then chapter 2, and this is where things begin to go desperately wrong. Chapter 2, how to be in communion with the Pope, with the hierarchy, with the bishops, with the magisterium. And chapter 5, what would communion mean among the people of God? Now, in my opinion, the material in chapter 5 should be in chapter 2, and the material in chapter 2 should be in chapter 5. In other words, communion, yes, is the essence. And since the church is 99% about people, what would communion among the people look like? And how would people exercise their place and their responsibilities within that sense of community? And then what kind of leadership would we need to reinforce and to support that universal sense of community, universal in the sense of church? Now, to my mind, that's what I want to see this Synod trying to address. Can we get some clarity on all that?
You wrote a book called When the Disciple Comes of Age, Christian Identity in the 21st Century. Then can we talk also of a church coming of age? Are we there? Are we there? And how prepared is the church for this event, based also in whatever you have said?
Back in 1970, theologians in the Catholic Church, we reckon that 95% of them at that time still were priests. Priests, in other words, theology was mainly the reserve of what we call the clericalized church. And about 5% were lay people, and those were mainly sisters, 1970. Now today, we reckon from the broader general research being done, that the lay proportion of theologians in the Catholic Church is somewhere between 60 and 70%. And so the priest theologian is a declining entity and reality. Some of those lay people are every bit as conventional and traditional as any traditional cleric would have been. But by and large, these lay people are bringing a ferment into theology, into scripture. They're asking deeper questions. They are asking the more adult questions. What does it mean to be adult in the church? And indeed, it is about a horizon of community, but in this case, including creation, as well as including people. Now, in their research, they're also surfacing new understandings historically, which are quite important for us. And I just want to draw your attention and the attention of people that might be looking at this video to this book, which came out in 2021, After Jesus, Before Christianity. The contributors to that book are mainly lay people. They're all scripture scholars, mainly in America, unfortunately, but that's where the book is coming from. And what they're looking at is, they're looking at the development of the church in the first 300 years before Constantine came on stream and began to give a new direction to the church in terms of the imperial consciousness of Rome at the time. And they're critiquing the way we read and interpret the early history of the church, which of course has mainly been done by priests, historians, and theologians, in which quite rightly they do highlight the beginnings of a clergy, the beginnings of bishops and other leaders, and the beginnings of a more formal structure. And yet that was a dimension. But what has not been given credit, these people claim, is that in those first 300 years, there was a people's movement, which was very dynamic, it was very creative, and it was focused mainly on a whole range of small groups. And many of those groups were fully Eucharistic without necessarily having a priest. When Constantine came along in the beginning of the 4th century, then he began to change all that by adopting the more imperial model. And within 100 years, then you had a more clericalized side of the church growing and developing. So these, when we talk about the disciple coming of age, there's something about revisiting our scriptures and prioritizing the kingdom of God, which is the foundation of all authentic Christian community, it seems to me. But there's also something about revisiting our history and beginning to see the history in a more inclusive way and in somewhat a deeper way. And I think a number, I don't know a great deal about the lay participants at the Synod itself, but I think some of them will certainly be coming from that background. And a lot of the lay people that are looking to the Synod for some life and hope, I think it is around this desire for a more participative sense of the church as community, locally, regionally, and globally.
Thanks, Diarmuid. In the preparatory document for this synod is written also, this is an ecclesial process that can only take place at the heart of a hierarchically structured community.
Okay.
It is in the fruitful bond between the sensus fidei of the people of God and the magisterial function of the pastors that the unanimous consensus of the whole church in the same faith is realized. Then my question is a hierarchical structure compatible with a synodal one?
I think that's a very critical question for the Synod itself to look at. And certainly among a growing body of these lay theologians that I'm talking about. And I think a lay consensus within the body of the people in themselves are beginning to feel more and more an incongruence, is the word I would use, between the emphasis on hierarchy and their desire for something more communal. This is where I think also the other sciences can have something quite important to contribute here. And I think a lot of the lay people that are desiring something different from this Synod would be influenced by other sciences, whether it's quantum physics, whether it's cosmology, or whether it's the insights coming from the social sciences today. So for instance, if you look at contemporary biology and even the training of our biologists to the present time, biologists are told to look in the natural world for nested hierarchies. In other words, the Russian doll, things within things. To understand me, you need to understand my family, the next greater whole. To understand my family, you need to understand the culture of the country I come from and so forth. That everything belongs to a set of wholes, W-H-O-L-E-S. And the biologists call those nested hierarchies. That's because their whole training has desired that they think that way. But in actual fact, what they're looking at, a lot of modern scientists would say, they're not looking at nested hierarchies. They're looking at what we call holarchies. W-H-O-L-A-R-C-H-I-E-S, holarchies. Now, holarchy comes from the concept of the whole. And it is this what I've just been saying. To understand me as a person, you need to understand the series of wholes, W-H-O-L-E, to which I belong. That's what's known as holarchy. My personal opinion on this matter, and I think a growing number of biologists are moving in this direction, that strictly speaking, there are no hierarchies anywhere in nature or anywhere in God's creation. That when the biologists talk about nested hierarchies, they're actually looking at holarchies. And therefore that creation, as the creation of our God, is programmed primarily for holarchies, not for hierarchies. And therefore, our spirituality should be exploring primarily what would holarchical structures look like, whether among humans or in the wider world of nature. And therefore, I think for our church here needs to listen to the insights and the wisdom of some of these other sciences, and therefore maybe begin to correct the language that they're using there in the preparatory document. They're almost saying, which would be a very unhealthy thing now to say, we must not touch or interfere with the hierarchical reality of our church. It's a God-given reality. Well, if it's not a God-given reality in creation, then why should it be a God-given reality in the life of the church? I think this is a very sensitive, delicate, but important question that does need to be looked at.
And Richard Rohr also quotes Ken Wilber, and then saying that good power is revealed in what Ken Wilber calls growth hierarchies, which are needed to protect children, the poor, the entire natural world, and all those without power. How that resonates with you?
Yeah, I would slightly reword all that, and in a sense, I'm disagreeing with him, because I would say, to protect and promote more meaningful power, we need to have a culture of empowerment to do it. And rather than looking for key people to be the primary activators of all that, the more we can mutually enrich and skill different people to contribute to it, the better it will be. Even in the, I can look at my own family life, in which my parents, would have given very direct orders towards children, and sometimes would have even hit us physically, because that was accepted at the time. And nowadays, in terms of parenting skills, parents are encouraged to do things very differently. And a small example of that in my own family, which I found quite informative, was some years ago when my niece, who was about 6 or 7 at the time, and she asked her mother, my sister, a question, and my sister answered it, but kept on cooking the meal or doing what she ever was. And my niece, which I very much admired her for, said, "Mammy, when I'm speaking to you, would you please look at me?" And now, to me, that's something about the desire for mutuality. So in other words, my sister, probably being busy doing other things, answered her and gave a meaningful answer, but did not look at her. And so she was expecting her mom to look at her as a person to person, in that regard. So again, I'd come back to that distinction between the holarchy and the hierarchy. I think the concept of the holarchy is much more innate to our world. It's much more liberating. It's much more empowering. And so there's a part of me would like to move away from the notion of hierarchies. So I would say, politically, economically, and ecclesiastically, we need to be moving away from hierarchies towards something more of the holarchical paradigm.
Thanks, Diarmuid. Also, in this preparatory document, it said the consultation of the people of God does not imply the assumption within the church of the dynamics of democracy based on the principle of majority. Then Ormond Rushd, in his contribution Inverting the Pyramid, the Sensus Fidelium of a Synodal Church, says that with Pope Francis, synodality now means not son of the bishops, son of the time, but all of the church, all of the time.
Okay, yes.
Now, it is said that in the Catholic Church does not exist democracy. Do you agree about that? And then how this could go with synodality?
Right. Now, I think the issue of democracy is actually becoming increasingly problematic around our world, politically and economically. Because for so much of our history over the past few thousand years, what we mean by democracy embodies hierarchical structures. And as we try to move more and more towards a more communitarian, holarchical way of operating, democracy itself in several parts of the world is becoming more and more problematic. So, no, I wouldn't want the church to say we must become a democracy, because the whole history of democracy itself, I think, is somewhat tainted and problematic. What I would want to say is we must become more communitarian. And therefore, in terms of communitarian or communal process, we're looking, therefore, at decision-making primarily through consensus. And that's a very skillful art and not an easy one to achieve. But it can be learned, and there are many people from the social sciences who are trying to refine the skills of what consensual processes look like. Mm-hmm. It can be messy at times, it can be very time-consuming, but it is the more adult way of involving people. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, if we're talking about consensus among people, we have to look at consensus with the wider web of life as well. The word democracy is not the right word here. The word community, communal process, and then tracing back the roots for that understanding of structure to the notion of the kingdom of God in the Gospels, what kingdom of God understood as the companionship of empowerment. That's the source. In this desire for a more democratic church, I think it's a desire for a more communal way of being church, but that's not just for the sake of being nice to each other or for the sake of including each other. It is based solidly, I believe, on the Gospels and on the vision of Jesus. About the history of the church, and I suppose particularly since the time of Constantine, power, patriarchal power, hierarchical power became a very central issue. On the understanding that our God is a ruling king and rules down through selected people for the benefit of the whole. And I think that model is the one that's not merely in the life of the church, but politically, economically, and socially, that model is becoming more and more dysfunctional. And of course, as many of your listeners will already know, the unfortunate issue of sex abuse in the life of our church has nothing really to do with sex. It's the abuse of power. And all the research shows that very clearly. And so we do in our church. And this is not merely a Catholic problem. I think this is a problem right across the major world religions. And I think in ways quite a serious problem, for example, in the Muslim religion at the present time. This perception and understanding that God rules through a particular type of power, and that we must be receptive and respectful of that. Whereas it seems to me that the whole vision of our gospel as a Christian people, and particularly through the parables, through the Sermon on the Mount, through the healing miracles, is an orientation towards empowerment. And therefore, how do our leaders and how do our people begin to work together to create a church and a world where mutual empowerment becomes more real and more fulfilling to the benefit of everybody, and indeed to the benefit of the wider creation as well. So I'd like to see a move away from the emphasis on a unique, spiritually mandated power to the call for empowerment for everybody.
Thanks, Diarmuid. Also in the preparatory document and in line of what you are saying now is written, the whole church is called to deal with the weight of a culture imbued with clericalism that she inherits from her history, and with those forms of exercising authority on which the different types of abuse are grafted. Then this synod on synodality probably will question patriarchal structures and toxic ways of exercising power, and probably will expose the wounds of so many collectives that have been marginalized along history in the church. Then is the church ready to listen to this process, to humble herself, and to indeed engage in a reconciliation process?
Well, I think there's a double part to that question. Is the church ready? I would think there's a lot of people in the church who are ready, and I guess there are a lot who are not, and maybe are very resistant. There are two issues I'd like to see this synod address, but I don't think the readiness is there yet for it. But if we could create a readiness even to address it, would be a major step forward. So you mentioned the word clericalism. Now, in the history of our church, I think clericalism became a major problem after the Council of Trent in the 16th century, when we took the priest and put him up on a pedestal as the kind of supreme model for all Christian life. And as you know, and many of your listeners will know, for example, the study of theology then became a reserve for the priest or the priest-to-be, the clerical student, for the next 400 years, down to the middle of the 20th century. And so I think it was that over-exalted status that has led then to an enormous amount of the abuse and I'm not just talking about sexual abuse, in the life of our church over the past 300 to 400 years particularly. We're now at a stage where priesthood understood as clericalism. So I like to draw the distinction between priesthood, which in its oldest understanding is the servus servorum Dei, the servant of the servants of God, with all the emphasis on service, as distinct from clericalism, which is that kind of mandated or specific divine power, which was particularly emphasized, I think, from Trent on. So to my mind, the crisis we have in priesthood today is, number one, can we make that distinction and try and get clarity on that distinction? That we have now ended up, or we're in danger of ending up, with more clericalism than genuine priesthood. And so there is, again, a crucifixion. That's the word I use. And I think that's the word that needs to be used. There is a crucifixion of clericalism going on. And I think priesthood as we know it today, certainly in Europe, and I think probably right across the world over the next 20 to 30 years, is going to virtually die out completely. And we need to face that as a Christian people, because certainly already for us in Europe here, we have a dire shortage of priests, and we're doing things like coupling or creating what one bishop here now calls families of parishes, so that we try to ensure people will have a Sunday Mass. But what we're doing in the meanwhile is we're undermining and we're eroding any sense of local faith community. So we are doing something quite damaging in order to try and hold on to a priority of clericalism. And then that leads to my second observation. If priesthood as we know it is dying out and is going to diminish very seriously, where does that leave people with their sacramental life? And of course, you know it from your experience in Africa, perhaps more than anybody else. Our understanding of sacrament is actually arises originally from our human capacity for ritual making. We're all born with that capacity. And you see it wonderfully lived out at times in the rites of passage of many indigenous peoples around the world. And of course, the missionary Vincent J. Donovan, when he went to work with the Messiah people, that was one of his great insights. They already, in his view, had all 7 sacraments in their very rich rites of passage. Therefore, I think we need to start making the statement, and I've been making it for about the past 10 years in various workshops. Sacraments belong primarily to people. They do not belong primarily to priests. So what do we need to do to begin handing the sacraments back to our people? Because our people have great difficulty. They don't even know how to begin reclaiming. There's a huge re-education to be done. And I think those two dimensions are closely related. And whatever priesthood of the future will look like, I think it might look like something like the priest of the future being the ritual, being the leader in the process of ritual making. Not monopolizing it, but obviously having something of that deeper discerning wisdom to help the people themselves to rediscover their capacity for ritual making. It's a Calvary moment. It's a pastoral journey moment. How do we allow something to die that has become so dysfunctional? Can we let go of it and trust that the Spirit will bring about the new in due course? And meanwhile begin exploring what would it mean to begin handing sacraments back to the people and inviting people to take responsibility and enter into their own training to be able to reclaim their responsibilities as sacramental people. I'd love to see the Synod address those issues, or even to somehow prepare the ground where we could begin to have a conversation along those lines.
You talk often in your books about the evolutionary logic of birth, death, and rebirth. Richard Rohr also, he talks about the wisdom pattern of order, disorder, and reorder.
Yeah.
Then we are talking now about the crucifixion of clericalism and then a Calvary moment. It looks like this synod on synodality probably will invite us also to enter into a process of deconstruction, in a process of disorder, in a process of death. Now, how ready do you think the church is to undergo this stage now?
We're not really, and I'll speak here for a moment. Part of my background is in grief therapy. I think the challenge here for all of us as a church, and this includes lay people, this is not just about priests or bishops, is it's almost an invitation to enter into a grieving process. And that means, can we rise above the denial? Can we face the fact that there is a crisis? And that the crisis is not just about sex abuse. I think that can be a bit of a distraction, because as I've already said, the research shows very clearly that sex is not so much the problem, it's the abuse of power is the problem. The whole notion of a formal priesthood, and particularly as a male, more exclusively male, is little more than about 5,000 or 6,000 years old. Now, of course, there are people that have been kind of indoctrinated in the fact, well, it's the past 2,000 years that are important. Doesn't matter what happened before then. This won't necessarily mean a great deal. And therefore, again, we're back into the need for re-education. So after the agricultural revolution, about 10,000 years ago, there was that gradual movement towards more patriarchal ways of doing things. First, it happened with the creation of kings. Some people think that kings have been around forever. They haven't, in fact. Kingship is only about 7,000 or 8,000 years old. Warriors on horseback, which brings in the whole kind of the violence of the patriarchal system. And then the third institution was that of priests, male priests, whose primary role was to create sacrifices to appease the god. So again, the god was kind of perceived as being similar, identical with the king, if you like. So that was the beginning of priesthood, with the emphasis on sacrifice as we understand it today. We as a human species have been on this planet for 7 million years. And we have evidence to show, back to ritual for a moment, we were burying our dead with elaborate rituals 70,000 years ago. And we have archaeological evidence to show for that. Then against that background, this particular understanding of priesthood is very recent. So why should it be around forever? The fact that it's now in deep trouble is part of an evolutionary process. And then how can we allow it to die? How can we help it to die? And how can we become more responsive, more adult ourselves, facing up to that? I think that, for me, is the more adult, discerning conversation that will need to take place across the Catholic world over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And indeed, as I've to repeat myself, this is not just a critical issue for Catholicism. This affects all the Christian churches. And I think in due course will become problematic for some of the other monotheistic religions as well.
Yeah. And before we talk about democracy and then how irrelevant can be that word currently, and then Arnold Mindel, he talks about deep democracy, and then he's listening and validating all the voices, welcoming them as needed for the system, for the organization, or for the institutions. And he also talks of being deeply democratic with the different levels of reality. And then he differentiates between the consensus reality and the non-consensus reality.
Right.
And part of this non-consensus reality is basically what he calls the dreamland and the essence reality. Under the dreamland, we are talking about emotions, feelings, dreams, imagination, the dreaming process of the Australian Aboriginal. Then now, in which way this dreamland that goes together with emotions, feelings, dreams, and imagination are in need of expression and validation to navigate this chaotic and moment of disorder?
I think for me, there are two metaphors at play there. And you may have heard this yourself, because a lot of people facilitating religious orders today use these two metaphors. One is the midwife, and the other is the hospice carer. So the midwife is all about how do we help to bring something new to birth? And of course, we'd all love to be in the place of the midwife. But very often the midwife cannot do her work, until we first attend to the needs of the hospice carer. And the hospice carer is the one who sits with the dying and tries to allow and facilitate as much dignity and peace for the dying person or the dying reality. Now, that's an area where you talk about emotions. Obviously, there are a lot of very deep and difficult emotions at stake. The emotions in the midwife tend to be a bit more exuberant and joyful and outgoing. And as I've already said, we'd all love to be there. But we also need people who have the skills and the wisdom, and above all the discernment, to be with the hospice care, and to also know that that is right too, and has its time and has its place. And emotionally there, as every hospice carer knows, one will need regular supervision and a lot of regular support, because the emotions are more difficult. They're about loneliness, they're about anger, they're about helplessness. But these are human emotions too. And so I think that's the challenge facing us in religious life and in the church generally over the next number of years. How do we try to honor the hospice carer while also awaiting the right time to honor the midwife?
Okay, thanks, Diarmuid. Now, one of the risks also in this process, especially when dealing with unpleasant emotions, then now is to engage in what is called spiritual bypassing. And then spiritual bypassing is defined as using one's spirituality to avoid facing unresolved issues, either on a personal, interpersonal, or systemic level. Then now, in this process of synodality in which we are now, do you think that we are having the risk of engaging in spiritual bypassing and therefore being controlled by these forces that we are suppressing and neglecting and not facing?
Yes, I think there is a great danger there. And of course, any of us in religious life, I think, will have your age group and mine would probably have encountered that in the past from well-meaning but not very helpful formators who said, well, go away and pray about it and everything will be fine. When maybe we should have been told, well, go and get some professional help with that particular problem, whether it had to do with an addiction, whether it had to do with a sexual problem or an authority problem or whatever. And so the tendency to over-spiritualize is, I think, a real danger for us. I was just reading yesterday in the magazine called The Tablet, Vincent Nichols, the cardinal in England, had a pastoral letter last week, again saying the kind of things we've been saying, that the Synod is not meant to be an ecclesiastical United Nations assembly, not a church parliament, not a church convention, not a referendum on the teaching of the church. So it's none of those things. He said, quoting Pope Francis, but it will be a grace-filled event, a process of healing, and will be guided by the Holy Spirit. Beautiful, noble aspirations. Nobody will doubt about that. But, you know, I read there a tendency to sort of say, well, if everybody is nice to each other and we keep a spirit of prayer, it will work well. Whereas, in fact, we have some very difficult issues to face. And even naming them will not be pleasant. But they need to be named if we're to be people of integrity in a church of integrity. And so, yes, there is that danger that we over-spiritualize, or spiritualize in a way that is not healthy. And that's why I keep coming back to this word discernment. Because as I understand Christian discernment, it's looking at all the factors that are involved, the pleasant ones as well as the unpleasant ones. and then trying to, and in an atmosphere of consensus, then begin asking, where is the Spirit leading us here or inviting us here? And maybe reminding people that often the Spirit is most fertile in the midst of chaos. We see that in the opening verses of the book of Genesis. The Spirit drawing forth order and creativity from the chaos of creation itself. And I think on that note, then, use the word discernment more frequently. And I think we'd be on more authentic grounds in dealing with issues.
In the preparatory document also of this Synod on Synodality is written, in order to journey together, we need to let ourselves be educated by the Spirit to a truly synodal mentality, entering with courage and freedom of heart into a conversion process. Therefore, in this synodal process, we are called to be co-creators, no, with the Holy Spirit, no? And the First Nations show us how to collaborate responsibly with the Great Spirit. Then, what can we learn from the First Nations, no, in this regard? Yeah.
Okay, so I think, let me also say by way of introduction here, I think we have something quite important to learn from our First Nations peoples in terms of their spirituality. Now, many of them struggle themselves because they're influenced by modern influences like the rest of us are. So firstly, in terms of their spirituality, they use the phrase, the Great Spirit. They don't use the word God usually. And what they mean by the Great Spirit, again, they tend not to speculate or what we would call theologize about the Great Spirit. For them, their sense is that the Great Spirit is there in the soil, in the earth, in the land, in the material creation itself. And it's important for the hearers to realize they're not talking about pantheism. They're not saying that God is confined to the earth or to the soil. And therefore, through a more organic relationship with the land, with its fertility, with its cycles, with its seasons, they come to understand and internalize a sense of the Great Spirit at work in the whole creation, including themselves. And therefore, their rituals, and again, I think we have a lot to learn from them about what good ritual could mean. Their rituals, therefore, are not about trying to pacify God, to pacify God, but rather to enable them and empower them to try and enter into a more organic, meaningful relationship so that they can work more collaboratively with God through a more appropriate and responsible care for the earth. Now, so that's the belief. And I think I'd love to see theologians incorporate some of those insights into how we do theology, particularly when it comes to deal with the Holy Spirit. Why, therefore, do we find among some of our indigenous peoples around the world today that they also have huge problems around drugs, around other abusive substances, around power struggles, indeed a lot of the same issues that we have within the church itself are among other peoples and other cultures. And this is a factor that sometimes, again, in the history of the church, we have not given much attention to. And that may be because the social sciences are more a development of the 20th and 21st centuries. And it's this word systemic, that we humans are not just creatures who operate on our own, as if only the human reality mattered. We're all part of systems. We're all part of structures, political, economic, social, and so forth. And these structures and institutions can have a far bigger influence on us than we care to acknowledge. So, for instance, we all know about the power of media, the power of advertising. Well, we know about it in theory, but in practice, a lot of people don't realize how much it touches our lives and influences us. And so how to be aware of the power of systems and that we're all parts of systems. A religious community is a system, a family is a system, a parish is a system. And in every system, the principle of quantum physics works. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Therefore, to really understand, so for example, in a parish council is not just about 10 individual people. It's when those 10 people come together, they become a group, they become a system. And often things can be going on, what we call group dynamics, in that group, which can stymie or undermine seriously the work of the group, unless the group has the skills to be more aware of the dynamics going on and can have the maturity and sometimes the aid and support of a facilitator to address those dysfunctionalities. So, and in that way too, I don't doubt for one moment the divinity and the divine power of the Spirit, but we, through our human behaviors, particularly our collective behaviors, and the behaviors that we're often not aware of, we can seriously block the Spirit at work, particularly in our group processes, whether that be a parish council, whether it be a parish, whether it be a school, whether it be a workplace. And so, yes, the work of the Spirit, I have no doubt about the creativity of the Spirit and the ability of the Spirit to draw forth creativity and potential from chaos. Now, you see, as human beings, particularly in our group contexts, we tend to ward off anything that feels a bit chaotic or over-challenging. And we can have some very subtle dynamics through which we do that by keeping silent, or not speaking directly to the issue, or distracting ourselves from the issue by cracking jokes or something like that. These are all the kind of dysfunctional dynamics. Fortunately, today in the world and in the church, we now have a lot of good people who are well trained with the skills that can help and support us in these matters. I think myself that every dynamic parish council should bring in an outside facilitator maybe once a year to help the group itself to look at the dynamics at work in it. And in that way, face the difficult issues, face the chaos, and that'll make us more creative and productive at the end of the day. Yeah. So yeah, I've no doubt about the energy and the potential of the Spirit, but we also need to be much more aware and much better educated on how we, not merely individually, but particularly systemically, can block the work of the Spirit.
One way of understanding these dynamics of blocking the work of the Spirit is by not dealing with the elephants in the room, no? And then now we know that the elephant in the room is a metaphorical idiom, no, in English, no, for an important or enormous topic, question, or controversial issue that is obvious or that everyone knows about, but no one mentions or wants to discuss because it makes at least some of them uncomfortable and is personally, socially, and politically embarrassing, controversial, inflammatory, or dangerous. Then now, my question is now, do you envision some elephants in the room in this synod on synodality? And if yes, could you name them?
I think I've already named one, and I'll name it again, and that's clericalism. Yeah. And the various shapes and forms that can take. So a very personal example, and I hope this is not offensive to my friends in the Philippines. I have challenged people at times in the Philippines when they keep calling me father to call me by my first name. I even say, I wasn't baptized father, I was baptized Diarmuid. Mm-hmm. So can you not call me by can you not honor me as a person rather than someone in a role? And the answer they'll always give, well, that would be disrespectful. And we've always been told to respect the priest. Mm-hmm. Now, you see, what's going on there can be quite unhealthy because, in a sense, that's been one of the contributory factors to the sex abuse and indeed to other forms of abuse too. we put a person then so far up on a pedestal that, we don't know how to challenge our the scenario that often happened, unfortunately, with the sex abuse. So the priest took the boys away for a camping holiday, or they were going up to his house frequently. And the kind of naive parents said, but he's a priest. They're 100% safe with him. In other words, there was no acknowledgement that we priests are human beings, first and foremost. And we have all the basic needs that human beings have. And because we're human, we also have a lot of the fragilities of the human condition. So that's what I mean by the elephant in the room, that we're afraid. It's almost like, maybe it's over spiritualizing. That can we regard our priests as human beings? Okay, they have a special vocation, but so has 110 other people in other professions. They have a unique vocation. We're not doubting that, but they are human beings. And at the moment, we're exhausting many of them because of the demands we're putting on them. And that would be one way of trying to name the elephant in the room, would begin, in a sense, let's look at our common humanity as we gather in this gathering, the Synod, or whatever gathering it may be. First and foremost, we're all human beings in this room. And that would be an interesting place to start. Whether you're a bishop, whether you're a parish priest, whether you're a cardinal, whether you're a pope, we're all human beings. Let's start there. There's also something about an adult honesty about that. I think that would be a way of naming the elephant.
We, in this globalized world and in which we live, in our religious congregations and in the church, we are living more and more in communities that they are multicultural, and we aim to intercultural living. And right. we come to our communities also as a human being, and then now we know that myself coming from a particular country or a particular culture brings also my history with me, and then this history from time to time has been affected by colonizing or being colonized by unresolved and non-processed issues in humanity, and then very often we can bring that to our communities, and that can affect our living together. Then now, in which way also can we say that unprocessed issues in history connected with our humanity can be a huge elephant in the room also in this synodal process?
I often find myself talking about the story of Jesus. We say Jesus was fully God and fully human. Well, you can't be fully human unless you make mistakes. Therefore, Jesus made mistakes. The story of the Syrophoenician woman, he made one awful blunder on that one. You won't have gone round the towns of Israel till the Son of Man appears in glory. If he said that, well, he made one big mistake as well. And so there's something about, can we acknowledge the greatness of our humanity on the one hand, and it's the great potential in it, but also acknowledge that we're all frail human beings who can make mistakes, who can get things wrong, and then can we learn to forgive and forget? And so again, the elephant in the room there would be something about that we're treating certain people, whether it's our priests or our bishops or whatever, that somehow or other they have a perfection or a holiness that the rest of us don't have. And so putting them on this pedestal, which at the end of the day does no good for them, nor for the church at large. And therefore, by bringing everything back to that more human level and trying to keep the conversation at the human level. So again, be vigilant when the conversation tends to veer off into over-spiritualizing. The Holy Spirit will guide us through that. Okay, but what are some of the challenges in that? What are the blocks that we're likely to put in the way? What would be the discerning skills we would need to be more open to the Holy Spirit? So again, that elephant in the room, the tendency to over-spiritualize. Can we call a halt to that? Can we speak to it? Can we challenge it? So in a sense, I've named, I suppose, 3 elephants in the room already. I've talked about clericalism. I've talked about avoiding the basic human level that we all share and honoring it. And then the tendency to over-spiritualize.
Now we are talking about the power of vulnerability as something very important, no, in this synodal process. No, as we become more and more human, it's a journey of being vulnerable, no, and being able to share from deep within, and also this synodal process also as a moment where we are invited to be accountable. And then now, what is the role of accountability and the role of vulnerability?
Taking first the vulnerability one, I find myself as a counsellor, and I think, you know, a lot of parents could speak to this and other people in dealing with their children, for example. When we allow a person to tell their story, we create a context where the story can be heard non-judgmentally. That can be extremely freeing and liberating for people. In other words, the warts and all, as we say, it all comes out. There's no judgment, and nor should we be quick to run in and offer solutions. There's something about honoring a story given as a story with its dark side and its light side and so forth. And again, I suppose that's generally something we're not good at, in the sense that the gym will fix it attitude tends to come in. Just listening to the story, listening particularly to the difficult bits of a person's story or a group story, and just simply holding the story and honoring it. I find that a helpful way of dealing with the vulnerability. Now, the accountability is a much more complex question. So, for instance, here in my home country of Ireland, we have this clustering of parishes. And the basic line is, well, the people must have a mass. So there's little or no recognition of the damage being done to local communities. And there's no attempt at all at giving the skills to local communities to be able to even to conduct Eucharistic liturgies in more creative ways. So the only accountability is from the top down. There's no facility in place there for a mutual accountability. Unfortunately, that's what a lot of people want. They just want it that way. They don't want to be involved in some new way. Now, presumably, most of the lay people at the Synod are people that really do want to be more involved in their church. So we do have a problem about trying to encourage more people with a desire to be involved. And an education will be required that involvement needs to involve a sense of accountability. So it's not just accountability from priest to people, it's also accountability among the people themselves, and then it's accountability among the priests themselves, obviously with their bishop. So it's accountability at a whole range of different levels. An attempt at accountability that'll make consensus work better, that'll make the building of community work better, that'll help the church to become that kind of empowering community that will better reflect the new reign of God. Mm-hmm. So the accountability has a whole range of practical dimensions to it, but I think, for me at least, there's also a deep theological, scriptural dimension to it, that without a good, healthy, and dynamic structure of accountability, we can't claim that we're being accountable to the new reign of God and to the mission, sense of mission that arises from that.
And before we talk about creation, no, and how creation can be inspirational, no, for us as human beings, but also as organizations and institutions, no. Then now, in which way can we be inspired by the metamorphosis happening, no, in the life cycle of a butterfly?
I would say death and resurrection.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that when the caterpillar reaches a certain critical stage, it's almost like it has to die before it can give new life. Mm-hmm. It's a death resurrection process.
Yeah.
And then the new life kind of looks almost completely different from what the caterpillar was, but there's obviously a continuity there. Yeah. And I mean, the more homely example that I often share with people outside the window of the room from which I'm speaking now is this wonderful sycamore tree. Now, going into our autumn time here in Europe, that tree is beginning to shed its leaves. And within about the next 6 weeks, all the leaves will fall off and the tree is completely bare. And it often leaves me with a kind of feeling of bareness or barrenness. But I need to keep reminding myself that if the tree doesn't go through that process in the autumn time, there won't be any beautiful, luscious green leaves next spring. And again, that's an example of that same paradox of death and resurrection at work throughout the entire creation. And of course, at work in our own lives too, at different levels.
Then I am developing also what I call the metamorphic attitudes, as something that can be quite inspiring, to navigate in this wisdom pattern of order, disorder, and reorder. Then now, one thing that is very interesting, especially now in the caterpillar stage, is that the caterpillar, he will shed off his skin at least 4 or 5 times during his lifetime.
Okay. Yes.
Even he will be able even to eat the skin that has been shed off.
Right.
Basically, it's when to let go, but at the same time, we can still learn something out of history, learn something out of the mistakes, and be nourished by what we are letting go. Then now it can be inspiration also for today's church.
Yes, and therefore it is something about, and we're back to discernment again. When is something in kind of terminal decline, and that we need to somehow learn to flow with it rather than try to reverse it? And because I go back to the example of the tree again. I can't stop the tree shedding its leaves, no matter what I do, no matter how I try. So there is something about learning to flow with that process. There's something about learning to accept it and feel okay about it, despite the fact that I'm feeling very sad or feeling vulnerable in the face of it. That is a prerequisite to be able to go through those difficult feelings and emotions, to go through the losses, if you like, as I anticipate the birth of something new. Again, I won't necessarily be the one that will give birth to the something new, but I can anticipate it and facilitate its happening. That's the metaphor of the midwife when it comes about. And I think that is particularly apropos the issue of clericalism in our church today. And that's why, as I've already said, I dearly would love the Synod to make some attempt to begin addressing it. But as you're rightly hinting, unless people have some sense of openness and receptivity around the need for chaos, the need for disintegration at times, and the need to be able to somehow flow with it and be patient with it and gentle with it, but also acknowledge the very untidy, messy feelings it can leave one with. To me, that's all part of what we call discernment.
That also brings me to the issue of paradox, how paradox can be part of this synod on synodality. You're talking about making sense of chaos, that would be already very paradoxical. Then now,
sure.
How that can be inspirational also.
Yes, I think the best way to work with that, in my experience, is to keep giving people examples. My access to it is through the new cosmology, where they talk about this recurring cycle of creation, destruction, creation, destruction, creation, destruction. I mean, if we look at the outer sphere of our cosmos, at every stage in its history, in the galactic world, in the planetary world, there's huge destruction going on all the time. And if that wasn't going on, we wouldn't have the beauty of creation that we have. The other frightening and disturbing example for a lot of people are earthquakes. Earthquakes are absolutely essential to the well-being of planet Earth. And so how to make sense of earthquakes then in terms of the terrible destruction they can do to human life as well as to nature. That's another example of the paradox. I think it's when we take examples from the big scale but also from the more personal and more intimate level, that we can help people to see paradox is an innate God-given dimension of life. I think the problem here, I suppose, in terms of the history of the church, and maybe in terms of the formation, particularly that we priests get, with the study of scholastic philosophy, there's a huge amount of emphasis put on keeping everything very rational. Now, rationality is the opposite of paradox in a sense. If you're dealing with paradox, there isn't much rationality. Rationality doesn't help you to make sense of it. And so if we're overtrained, as many of us are, in trying to keep everything very rational, then I think we'll struggle to make sense of paradox. I think the mystics were among the people that embraced paradox in a more experiential and direct way. And many of them talk about it in their various writings. The dark night of the soul, the dark night of the senses are all ideas that help us to live through those times of paradox when the going is not easy, or when the landscape is not very clear. And so it's a bit, maybe it's like maybe another metaphor there would be the birth pangs awaiting the new life to come.
Yes, the last reference to this butterfly framework is when the butterfly comes out, there is a time where the butterfly doesn't fly because still the wings are too humid, and then they need to dry up, and also they have to be fully fledged of energy so that eventually can fly. And that basically is again an image to see a human being fully alive, or an organization that is really all-inclusive and every member feels participating and engaged into the process of that organization. No?
Right.
Now, these four wings of the butterfly, in this butterfly framework, is the wing of the past, the wing of the future, the wing towards the deepest of oneself, and the wing towards our relational life, our relation to the organization, to the system, even to society. And then now to be fully alive, the energy has to flow in the four winds, and then meaning that things have to be processed and things have to be reconciled and healing has to occur. Then now, in which way do you think that this metaphor of having fully fleshed four winds, can be meaningful in this process?
I would take that back now to our understanding of evolution. One of the more simple definitions of evolution is it's about growth, change, and complexity. Those three words. So everything in creation grows around us, and we love to see things growing. But change involves things dying at times, and even dying out. And that's the bit we don't like. But that's also necessary. And of course, in that context, unfortunately, we have even to disagree with St. Paul, that death is the consequence of sin. It's not. Death is an integral dimension and a very necessary dimension of this process. And then the complexity. So your four wings, that often the outcome then will never just take us back to what was there before. The outcome will be, to be more all-embracing, it will have some new dimensions to it, which will require adjusting. It will require us to have the eyes that can see the four wings, or four new dimensions, where maybe before there was only one. So going back to the issue of returning sacraments to people, would require that people will do sacraments quite differently from the way a priest might have done them, honoring the complexity of the reality in which people will find themselves. So that's where I would draw a parallel with your example of the four wings. The growth, the change, which will involve some letting go and maybe even dying, and then the opening up to the new possibility, which will have unexpected elements in it, unforeseen elements, maybe elements of sheer surprise. Some will be very joyful and some may be very perplexing. That in other words, if there's only one wing, we might be able to come to terms more easily with it. But there's four. How do we give attention to all four? That's what I would understand by the complexity.
Another very interesting thing on these butterflies is that the amazing capacity of the butterflies to develop this design in the wings, and then this design in the wings very often they are used to protect themselves. For example, there will be the color of the bark of the tree, so that eventually it will not be attacked. My question is now, in which way there is a wisdom behind, the need of protection, the need of boundaries, the need of there's a part of us that perhaps needs to protect itself. In which way that also could be interesting and inspiring this synod on synodality, the importance of getting in touch with that part of us that needs to protect itself.
Well, I think I will be asking the question, therefore, what are we trying to protect and why? If going back to that statement from Vincent Nichols, are we trying to protect hierarchy so that we mustn't ask any critical questions about it, or genuinely serious questions? Are we trying to protect clericalism so that we don't even begin to speak about the vulnerability of the present situation? In other words, when we talk about protecting, are we protecting with a view to allowing life organically and in more evolutionary terms to evolve towards greater complexity, which will be at times messy and untidy? Or are we trying to protect so that we're trying to keep just law and order all the time, which is not going to work? And particularly in a world of mass information in which we're now living in, with so much talk even about artificial intelligence and all that at the moment, this world of mass information, more and more people are now asking questions. More and more people are developing a critical mind. More and more people want to be involved, and with some extra skills and education, can begin to see the involvement can be messy at times and can be untidy. And so if we're rushing too much for protection and for order, we're going to miss the richness of the process. And we're also going to inhibit the spirit, which, as we have already said, will often work through chaos and bring out creativity out of it. So it's something about, can we step back a bit from maybe our compulsion for protection and allow a scope and a freedom for creativity to evolve and emerge?
Once we don't want to engage in vulnerability, we overprotect ourselves. No, it's not.
Correct.
And now we talk about that also vulnerability cannot be rushed, because we not to somehow bring change and transformation too abruptly when perhaps we are not ready for that. And then now, in that sense, protection can make sense, but not getting stuck into protection somehow.
Right. And that's where I think we're back into discernment. And that's where the skills that we use in training spiritual directors and people like that can be extremely valuable. And when to know when to move more gently, when to know when to push, when to know when to challenge. I think these are all parts of that process.
Yeah. And the last question is about, you talk about we live in a world where there is so much information, so much words. Now, what is the role of silence in this process? No, the force.
I think it's crucially important. Somebody has made the observation along a slightly different line, but could have a lot of relevance for the Synod. Back in 2019, I think it was, when this awful problem first started happening of these boats coming across the Mediterranean and huge numbers of people getting drowned, the European Union met on 10 occasions in the course of 15 months, I think it was. And they resolved nothing in terms of coming up with a solution for that awful problem. And I suspect myself, and other people have said this, the reason why they weren't able to come up with a solution is they probably went into the meetings and started debating and arguing and bargaining straight away. In other words, if they'd gone into those gatherings and maybe sat silently for 10 minutes to begin with, I think the outcome might have been very different and hopefully more constructive. I think we are bombarded with so much noise and with so much verbiage. I think silence is crucially important for our world today, at every level.
Yes, the power of silence. And now to conclude our interview, Diarmuid, now, could you share with us what is your wish for this synodal process?
Yeah, I think my wish is for honesty in dialogue, or dialogue in honesty, to face some of the real issues that need to be faced.
Thanks, Diarmuid, and dialogue in honesty. And I believe that this interview has been a living example of honesty, a living example of transparency. You have given us so much of your wisdom. You have given us so many insights that can be very helpful and will be very helpful in our discernment process as we involve ourselves, as we engage ourselves in this synodal process. Personally, I have benefited a lot. Thanks a lot, Diarmuid, and then hopefully we shall meet again in another interview.
Thank you.